The story of Oradour-sur-Glane is an example of the absolute brutality, cruelty, and inhumanity of war, and is a story that needs to be told. After the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, Nazi troops all over France scrambled to reach the front to stop the Allies from delivering France from Nazi occupation. The French resistance were doing their best to keep the Nazis from moving their troops to Normandy by sabotaging railways and using guerrilla warfare to harass the troops and pick off Nazi soldiers. By June 10th, the Nazis had had enough, and they were seeking revenge, as well as wanting to make an example and instill fear in the French. Thus, 200 Waffen-SS troops, under the command of General Lammerding, planned and performed an act of terror that resulted in the massacre of 642 men, women, and children living in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane. A plaque in the village reads, "On the 10th of June, 1944, the Waffen-SS Division Das Reich of the Nazi regime massacred 642 civilians, men, women, and children, and burned all the buildings. Erected as a national symbol after General de Gaulle's visit in 1945, the destroyed village, classified as a historic monument by the May 10, 1946 decree, must bear witness to the entire world throughout the years to the destruction accumulated on our territory during 4 years of oppression and violence. A stone wall was constructed around the village in 1950 to protect and give sanctuary to this place of memory." On this map, you can see the structure of the village. The center of memory is the first thing you see with the red dot, and then you enter the village, go straight, and you walk down the main road. You can see a word that says église, that means church. And then further up to the top of the map, you can see memorial, and that's where they have the cemetery and the memorial that we will visit during this virtual visit of Oradour-sur-Glane. This informational poster outside the visitor center gives you practical information for visiting Oradour-sur-Glane, which is closed in the depth of the winter in part of December and all of January, and has reduced hours throughout the winter. It also gives some directional arrows and shows you to the right where Limoges is located. This map gives you an idea of where Oradour-sur-Glane is located in France. You can see that Paris is to the north, pretty much due north, and you can see that the closest town is Limoges, which is the capital of porcelain in France, and is 22 kilometers or 13 and a half miles away from Oradour-sur-Glane. Above all, the ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane are still standing so that we may pay homage to the victims of this terrible massacre and never forget the barbarity of war. Much of what we know about this fateful day on June 10th, 1944 at Oradour-sur-Glane is from testimony that was given by some of the survivors. Not that there were many, but one of them is Robert Hébras, who, after a long silence, finally began to share his memories about what happened. And here's one of his books that I used to research this tragedy. Prior to the war, Oradour-sur-Glane was a thriving little village not too far from Limoges, with a tram that was built so that people from Limoges could go there to fish and enjoy the fresh air of the small village. Here are a few pictures from Robert Hébras' book, in which he shows the peacefulness of children fishing in the Glane River, and also the principal street, or the main street, with children. So you could see from these pictures that it was a quiet and thriving little burg. Today, as you enter the village, you were reminded to remain silent, as it's a place of memory, although the sign isn't necessary because you immediately feel the heaviness of this town. According to witnesses, the Nazis arrived in town at about 2 o'clock and started rounding up all of the people, telling them to leave the buildings and come to the central square. The square is known as the Champ de Foire, or the Fairfields. So all of the people started coming, and more people started coming. At 3 o'clock, the Nazis brought all of the children from the schools, brought them onto the square also. People were wondering why they were being assembled there, but they weren't too worried because they just assumed that this was some kind of identity check. Little did they know what was in store for them. This is a 360-degree view of the town square, where all of the victims were assembled and then separated by gender and age, the men on one side and the women and children all on the other. These are some of the school children who were taken from their classes and brought to the square. And these are some of the children from the girls' school that were also taken from their classes and accompanied by the Nazis to the square. The SS troops marched the women and children out of the square and took them down to the church, where they told them to wait. And in the meanwhile, they separated the men into 6 different groups and took them to different farm buildings, 3 different farm buildings, a garage, and then some other smaller buildings. Although the men were separated into 6 different groups at different points in the town, the massacre was coordinated by an explosion, signaling the beginning of the carnage. SS troops fired at the trapped men with machine guns and then shot survivors before setting the buildings on fire, using stockpiles of hay to ensure efficiency. In the meanwhile, the women and children gathered in the church could hear the shooting and explosions and were starting to panic. Today, at 6 points in the village, visitors can find signs indicating where the groups of men were killed. This sign reads, "Here, a place of agony. A group of men was massacred and burned by the Nazis." This sign reads, "Here were found 2 charred bodies." There's a special marker for Monsieur Poutarot because he managed to escape from one of the farm buildings, but was mowed down by the SS troops as he ran to the cemetery. These are the remains of the large farm building where the majority of the men were taken, and you can read the sign that says many men were killed here and burned here, but right next to it there's another sign that says 6 men escaped from this farm building, 5 of whom survived, and one of whom was Monsieur Poutarot. This is a photograph of Robert Hébras, One of the people who escaped, one of the 5 men who escaped, and who is the author of the book I showed you earlier, and also this book entitled Before My Voice is Extinguished. He basically escaped because many bodies fell on top of him, and he was able to find a way out of the building before it caught fire. This is a view of the church, which is at the south end of town. In front of it, there used to be a thriving marketplace. And this is where the women and the children were being held during the massacre of the men. Outside of the church, there is a sign that reads, Church of Oradour-sur-Glane, silence. Here, hundreds of women and children were massacred by the Nazis. You who pass by, reflect in silence. You who believe, please pray for the victims and their families. In the ruined village, the only things that remain standing are Christ on the cross outside and Our Lady of Lourdes and Bernadette on the inside of the church. Those who suffer may come to me, said Christ. Do what he tells you, said the Virgin. May they rest in peace because they live in eternity. Inside the church, the visitor can still see twisted metal and charred stone. The SS troops set up an explosive device in the middle of the church in front of the altar. After setting off the explosion, they machine-gunned women and children and then set fire to the church, trapping all the victims inside. One single woman was able to escape with injuries and was able to give testimony to the criminal brutality of the perpetrators. Madame Roufanche, the sole survivor of the massacre, had just had the horror of having her daughter shot while in her arms. She used the smoke screen to get behind the altar that you see in front of you and climbed through that middle window that you see that was already broken. She jumped down a few feet and then tried to help a woman who was behind her. When the Nazis heard the baby cry, they shot at the woman and the baby, killing them both, and Madame Roufanche, who sustained an injury but managed to run and was indeed the sole survivor of the church massacre. Many doubt that the massacre of the women and children was part of the original plan, but the evil brutality of General Lammerding and Lieutenant Barth, seen here, had already been proven in other crimes against humanity. Lammerding may have ordered the massacre of the women and children in order to eliminate witnesses to their savagery. Lammerding was sentenced to death, but never extradited from Germany, and lived as a successful businessman until the 1970s. Barth did do time in prison, but never even showed a shred of remorse. The following photos show the extent of the destruction, the burned out cars, the abandoned sewing machines, the bicycles, a picture of the garage, many signs that the town was a thriving village until the Germans or the Nazis decided to lay it to waste. This is the mechanic's shop, or the garage de surtout, that was used as one of the places to contain the men and then massacre them. This is the town post office. This is the hardware store. Here you can see the remnants of the tram line that ran between Limoges and Oradour-sur-Glane. A tram arrived in the afternoon, and the tram employee was shot and his body was thrown into the river. Monsieur Chalon's death brought the total of victims for the day to 643. Later, at 7:30 p.m., the regular evening tram arrived with a full load of passengers. Those Oradour residents who were returning home were separated from the rest and were then led to SS headquarters in a nearby village. They had to wait 2 hours until they finally were released. Not allowed to return home, they spread out and hid in the countryside. These pictures from Robert Hébras's book are of people searching through the ashes to try and find remnants of their loved ones. And the other picture is of someone transporting ashes to the cemetery. For the 70th anniversary of the massacre, the Center of Memory, along with the National Association of Families of the Oradour-sur-Glane martyrs, wanted to pay their respects to the victims by giving them a face. Thus, the Oradour-sur-Glane Faces Project was born. Photos of a great number of the victims were mounted on porcelain tiles and displayed in the Memory Center. Some are still blank, but many efforts are being made to find a visual representation of each of the 643 victims. This is the entrance to the cemetery, and as you can see, there is a marker. It says, "Here the dead are sleeping. Pilgrims, think about them in silence and with respect." While many of the tombs predate the massacre, the majority of the plots belong to those 643 victims. Featured prominently at the head of the memorial is a bouquet from the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. This is a monument to all of the victims of the massacre of the 10th of June, 1944. On the sides, you can see 2 glass containers that are repositories for bones and ashes of some of the victims. All around the monument are pictures, flowers, poems, plaques, all kinds of homage to the victims of the massacre. Oradour was not a crime due to madness, but the logic of a system. We must remember this so as to never see it again. We must live in and build a world in which crime will be folly again and reason will be peace. Claude Roy. Here, men did the worst thing they could possibly do to all the women in the world. They did not spare the children. Paul Éluard, 1944.